welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Alex Christoyannopoulos. Alex is a political scholar based at Loughborough University in the UK, and he's a leading expert on the topic of Christian anarchism. His PhD on this topic was published as the book Christian Anarchism, which is a leading scholarly text in this area. He's also the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence. Today, perhaps unsurprisingly, we discuss Christian anarchism. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Alex Christoyannopoulos. Alex, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to chat with you today. So maybe we can begin, since we're going to be talking about Christian anarchism, for anyone who isn't that familiar with anarchism, who has kind of images of chaos or violence in particular, I guess is interesting in light of the kind of pacifistic, non-violent aspect we're going to be talking about today. I wonder if you could give a bit of an overview of what anarchism is as a political philosophy.
Yes, I can try, although you won't be surprised to hear, like any other tradition, but maybe especially with anarchism, there's plenty of contestation about what anarchism means. But anarchism can mean all sorts of different things. It certainly isn't violence and chaos. Some people summarize anarchism as opposition to the state. I think that's increasingly accepted as insufficient. One way of defining anarchism today is it's a movement and or intellectual tradition of opposition to all forms of domination, so therefore the state, but also gender forms of oppression, socioeconomic oppression. Hence, for many anarchists, there's an opposition to capitalism. Quite a few anarchists are opposed to religion because of the historic connotations or the historic role of religions and churches in Europe, for example, where a lot of anarchism, as we name it, has emerged. So anarchism is also a trade union movement. It's an important part of the trade union movement from the 19th century onwards. A lot of anarchists are organizing for improvements in workers' rights, etc. Anarchism also is pretty keen on what they will call prefiguration, being the change you want to see, to quote, well, ostensibly Gandhi, but it's not clear he ever said that, but although it captures what he says, but means as ends in the making, so trying to be the alternative you want to see. And that's also why a lot of anarchists are actually much closer to sort of non-violence than to violence, because they precisely want to prefigure, to illustrate the kind of different way of organizing things that they would like to see. And so often with anarchism, you'll have a very keen awareness on the way in which decisions are reached and organized, the way in which politics is done, if you want. So a lot of anarchism does involve, let's say, long meetings, an attempt to sort of reach consensus rather than impose a decision, even by a majority on a minority. Anarchism could be all these things and more, but it is associated historically with violence and chaos because there were a minority at the time, anarchists in the 1890s in particular, that did kill a few people in Europe in particular, although in the end probably fewer than some single bombs we've seen more recently. It was a minority of anarchists at the time, but it was whipped up by the media at the time as a justification to clamp down on anarchism, and a kind of moral panic ensued. It justified all sorts of strong, what's am I looking for, kind of reinforcement of state power and etc. at the time. And so since then, anarchists are associated with terrorism, sometimes used interchangeably, certainly at the time, but that connotation is tired and false. And even though it's common and some media still repeat it, it's just a misunderstanding, certainly, of the intellectual tradition, the social movement, the history of that social movement, of that ideology that anarchism is.
Right. Yeah. So I think this means ends relationship is important for people to have in mind, right? That like some movements for social change think, well, we're the good guys and our ends are good. So if we just use violence and use state power, like we'll just do that and then we'll implement this better world that we envisage. But the anarchist critique is that, well, in doing that, you become the very thing that you are trying to resist. You become kind of domineering and cause harm. And then, so then within anarchism, there's this very kind of this emphasis on basically not doing that, on not becoming a force of control and dominance and oppression. And then you have this insurrectionary anarchist trend that you're talking about, right? Of like, well, actually, we will throw bombs at politicians and try to kind of, which in the 19th century,
But even the insurrectionary anarchists weren't all necessarily going out on to kill people. They were trying to whip up revolution. They were quite militant and agitating, if you will. That doesn't necessarily mean physical violence
Right.
against other human beings. Not it is more militant for sure. But in general, even for them, they play they give kind of considerable importance to, yes, building the society you want to see sort of bottom up, and not expecting change to be sustainable in the long run if imposed top down, because that involves precisely the repetition of forms of domination from the top down from states typically. Instead, they want to, what's the other word? That's the quote I'm looking for is not coming to me, but it's building, yeah, that's right. Building the new society in the shell of the old. It's from
Right.
the Workers of the World. So building it bottom up rather than having it imposed top down, which is why it's not threatening, because you're only going to get there if everyone agrees to it bottom up. It's the one ideology that's not going to threaten you to sort of impose a change top down.
Right. Yeah. So I think there's almost the anti-ideology sentiment of like I'm not even gonna I'm not going to do anything to force you to see things my way. Like freedom, right, is a very important part of this, right? That everyone's freedom is really the highest good.
Absolutely, one of the, I mean, slightly simplistic but not completely false way of portraying anarchism is that it's also an ideology that absolutely does not want to prioritize freedom over equality or vice versa. So typically we're told, socialism prioritizes equality over freedom, liberalism does the opposite. Well, for anarchists, both are equally important almost, and they refuse to compromise on either. So freedom is important, as is paying attention to forms of oppression that mean that some people are treated, if you want, unequally or with less social dignity, economic dignity, whatever. So both values are really important for anarchists.
Right. And I think they go nicely hand in hand, right? If you try to maximize freedom, and that includes maximizing the freedom of, say, someone who's homeless and doesn't have access to food and shelter, like, they're not very free in that moment. So working to create freedom for everyone does actually empower people and create more equality.
Exactly, and that's why we're a long way away from a properly free society when there are all sorts of economic structures, if you want, that we inherit within which people are locked, and so they're not free. And even those who think they're free probably operate within a pretty narrow range of what they consider to be free. So yes, that's absolutely, you're right. That's exactly why that's also important. Yeah.
Right. And then, so we're going to be talking about Christian anarchism today. And there's this famous anarchist slogan, no gods, no masters, which, in that kind of atheist section of anarchist thought, I can imagine religious anarchism maybe seeming to not fit as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the anarchist tradition, as it's commonly kind of talked about, emerges in the 19th century, largely kind of Europe, North America, Russia. I mean, we could contest that history. There's plenty of sort of similar sentiments that you can find in other parts of the world, and you can
Right.
go much further back. So just noting that. But if you just go even with that traditional understanding, yes, at the time, the anarchists who emerge are very critical of religion and of the church. These are not exactly the same thing, but they're connected, of course, right? And so for a lot of anarchists, a kind of opposition to religion and certainly to the church is part and parcel of their opposition to domination, to forms of oppression, etc. And so for a lot of anarchists, certainly in the 19th century, but still since, are vehemently anti-clerical and probably anti-religion as well. And so yes, no gods, no masters is a famous slogan that's adopted in the 19th century, repeated ever since, meant to capture kind of an anarchist position. If you want to be slightly provocative and again slightly simplistic about it, I suppose that a Christian anarchist equivalent, which you do find in some of the literature, you might have come across it, is no masters but God. And so it's the notion that you reject, if you want, earthly authority or human top-down authority, because ultimately you take your authority to be sort of divine. It's slightly simplistic because not every Christian or religious anarchist necessarily kind of approaches, if you want, divinity or God that bluntly. But it is the case that religious anarchism, Christian anarchism, sits uneasily for a few anarchists. And I have certainly encountered people who say that's a contradiction in terms, how can you even conceive of this? Just as I have encountered plenty of others who say, no, I can see the logic. Sure, I might dispute the origin of your position or the kind of religious grounding of it, but we can join at least in the arguments that we might share against all sorts of forms of domination, such as the state, capitalism, etc. We might disagree on religion, or at least the church, but even so, that's not necessary. And by the way, quite a lot of Christian anarchists are pretty anti-clerical as well, and not just Tolstoy, who is a particular brand of his own, who might come to him. But I mean, quite a lot of Christian anarchists, like quite a few kind of radical Christians, are very almost bitter, certainly upset by the kind of the history of the church, or what they might call Christendom, a very top-down, mainstream, pro-status quo form of Christianity that's benefited the elite, certainly ever since Christianity is adopted by the Roman Empire, basically. So you can be critical of religion, or certainly of the church and of clericalism and of certain editions of, say, scripture, from within a Christian anarchist position, for example. But yes, atheism is an important streak of a lot of anarchism, just not all.
Right. Yeah, and it's only quite recently I came across critiques of Christianity that point to the idea that Jesus may have never actually intended to set up a church, and that the idea may have been, to follow him as an example in the way you live your life, and then as soon as you get to Paul the Apostle starting to kind of spread the church through the Mediterranean, suddenly now you're into a different game. And so I've seen the term like Jesusist for someone who follows Jesus as opposed to being a Christian. I think I found that quite a useful thing to have in mind for people who have a kind of, understandably, maybe a knee-jerk reaction when they associate Christianity with kind of hyper-conservative forces that are involved in domination, as opposed to this radical Jesusism, you could say, not even using the word Christianity.
Absolutely. Another way in which you'll find this formulated in some of the literature is in talking about the aim to be not Christian, but Christ-like.
Right.
So precisely trying to sort of emulate the example of Jesus. I mean, look, if you pick up your New Testament, you're going to struggle to find plenty of justification for the church as we know it today. Far from it. In fact, Jesus is pretty upset and that's the word I'm looking for, not ranting, but he has a right go at the Pharisees and the Sadducees of the time, so kind of the religious authorities of the time, and he seems to be preaching an alternative, a rather radical alternative of love and forgiveness, and showing by your example a kind of an alternative way of relating to one another, etc. That's very different from the church as you see it today, and that's, by the way, one of the reasons why when the Bible becomes translated in the vernacular, when it starts to be translated into the local language of people, kind of late Middle Ages on, instead of being preached in the Latin, quite a few people around then, that's when the Protestant movement, the Reformation begins, people read it and think, this is much more radical than I thought. This book that says it's important says all this stuff. It's far from what you're doing. And so off you go with all sorts of offshoots of Christianity that try to return to the original meaning, as they would see it, of Jesus' teaching and example, which is pretty consistent through the New Testament and pretty different to what your Archbishop looks like.
Yeah. It's maybe this is a bit of a side note, but I definitely think there seems to be a recurring pattern that even in the New Testament Jesus is pointing to in that you have figures who bring genuine spiritual inspiration that affect people, and they want to kind of imitate their way of living. And then that catches on and becomes a powerful force in society. And then the forces of domination latch onto that, like Constantine in the Roman Empire taking on Christianity and saying, okay, well, we'll use this label now. And so I think it's not an accident that it's precisely because the core of the teachings are so powerful, I think, that then they become kind of ossified with this layer of ironically, the kind of complete inverse, of people rallying around power instead of following the message of siding with the powerless.
I mean, one of the standard ways of putting it, Tolstoy, he's an awkward Christian anarchist. I know Christian anarchism sounds quite niche for a lot of people, but you have I don't know about current positions within it. And Tolstoy, who's perhaps the most famous one for all sorts of other reasons as well, is a particularly awkward Christian anarchist because he doesn't believe in the resurrection, in the dogma, etc. He just likes the ethics of Jesus, but he writes particularly eloquently about all sorts of things. But one of the things he, among others, but he in particular is quite passionate about is exactly how. So for him, the Christianity was betrayed when, after 3 centuries of it being subversive and annoying to the Roman Empire, it is basically gradually adopted by Rome as the religion of empire. And at that point, Christianity, I forget the exact words, but at that point, Christianity, for these Christian anarchist ceases to be Christianity and becomes the religion of empire. It ceases to be what it was. If you can't subvert something, adopt it and reshape it from within, basically. And that's how quite a few Christian anarchists see the history of Christianity, certainly symbolically with Constantine. You can argue it begins before. Some people will go all the way back to Paul, as you mentioned before. But the idea is that it gradually changes and it becomes the very opposite of what was intended.
Right. Yeah, I think that kind of Tolstoy tradition of rational Christianity or non-supernatural Christianity, right? Because he didn't have much time for the miracles and the supernatural stuff. Yeah. My interest in this is very similar in that I think that in an entirely naturalistic way, you can understand teachings of love and connection and care leading us into states of wholeness and beyond the sense of self, beyond your selfish, worst, most base instincts. And so I think there's this Christianism and the teachings of Jesus can totally be embraced in an entirely rational, naturalistic way. So just as an aside, that's my my interest with this stuff.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Anecdotally, one of the things that tickled me right back when I started this, or soon before I started this PhD anyway, was I remember in the Republican debate for the nomination at the time, so to decide who was going to be the Republican candidate when it eventually became George W. Bush, and it must have been 2000 or thereabouts. They were all asked, "Who's your favorite political theorist?" And George W. Bush famously said, Jesus Christ. And I'm like, okay. Well, if you're going to take Jesus Christ as a political theorist, I mean, it's a bit of a stretch to describe it as theory, but what position does that lead to? And I suppose the Christian anarchist argument is that it leads to anarchism. So Christian anarchism is essentially a position according to which Christianity, whichever way you look at it, whether you buy into the miracles and the dogma or you just take Jesus as an ethical teacher, as it were, leads to anarchism, whether you're focusing on anarchism in terms of kind of bottom-up community, mutual help and care, mutual aid, etc., or you focused on the opposition to domination, etc. But it's therefore a position according to which Christianity, sort of properly understood or as intended, amounts to anarchism one way or another. And so you can have different types of Christianity, different types of anarchism in that configuration, but it's a position according to which, yes, in a sense, therefore, to call it Christian anarchism is a redundancy, the opposite of an oxymoron. You're saying twice what should mean the same thing.
Right. Yeah, and I wonder if maybe you could outline the kind of what a Christian anarchist community would look like in contrast to the state with its kind of hierarchical, kind of very anti-Christian, you could say, structure.
Yeah, so that's a bit more complicated for a number of reasons. One is that at the very least, the way in which I have studied Christian anarchism, and that's me confessing that there are other ways of approaching it and studying it and understanding it, has been largely exegetical in the sense that it's been sort of interpreting text. Okay, so and that's what quite a few Christian anarchists who have written about Christian anarchism do as well. You kind of look at the texts, the different bits of scripture, the New Testament especially, of course, and the Gospels, and you interpret it in a way that justifies an anarchist position of some sort. Now, that doesn't take you very far in terms of imagining exactly the configuration of your Christian anarchist community. It's more critical of kind of the current setup than it is imagining in much detail what it would look like. And this actually speaks to the broader issue that anarchists in general don't have, I'm generalizing, that clear a blueprint of the society they want to see, precisely because it's not something you can invent in advance and then impose top down. It's something that's going to emerge organically with the involvement of all those concerns and therefore shaped by the way they want it to be shaped. And so it's hard to predict, although you would want it to be, again, as consensual as possible, etc. So now the thing about the state is that even if you try and step back from it for a second, the state isn't just sort of a foreign thing. It's made of individual human beings who make it, who produce it, any structure is made of agents who produce and reproduce it, are born into it and reproduce. Now, the thing about the state is it's not just what the state does to people, it's rather what human beings do to one another through the state. And the thing there is, from a Christian anarchist perspective, is that what's being done is very far removed from what Jesus teaches and preaches and shows by his example he would like those who take up their cross and follow him to do to one another. So he keeps talking about loving and forgiving and not judging one another, certainly not condemning others when you're full of fault yourselves. I mean, there's plenty of things we could look at, and That's not what we do through the state. Through the state, I've shifted. I'll come back to your question, but so through the state, we condemn one another, we judge one another, we punish one another, we inflict violence on one another. All of that is to be done away with and replaced by, I suppose, a community. So this is where the word church could come in. Etymologically, it's interesting because it's got to do more with community than with church as we imagine it today. A building with crosses and plenty of money that's gone into building it, and it's beautiful and it's got paintings. That's not what the church means in the original language by the looks of it. It's more of a kind of community where you kind of care for the lost sheep, you help one another, you try not to condemn, but you don't really have a very full blueprint, I think, of what it looks like. I think it's fair to say. So yeah, that's my long answer. It's less a case of what it is than at least not, and it is not what we currently have. What the churches, the mainline churches of today, justify and legitimize in the states that they are close to.
Right, and so some of the kind of core, you mentioned like kind of care for each other, mutuality, that kind of thing, as being a kind of core principle that would be part of it, no matter how that actually played out in practice. And so maybe we can explore some of these kind of core traits. So I think so. You have some kind of horizontality, some kind of mutuality in economic relations, right, of caring for other people. And there was a great bit in your book, Christian Anarchism, where there's some really good quotes on this idea of voluntary poverty, and there was one which was like, if everyone tries to outdo each other in being basically the poorest, then that's actually a way to get rid of poverty, because you by gifting more than you take, you basically create a care economy. You create this kind of economy based on need and support for each other.
You're right to remind me of that. It's been a while since I wrote the book. There's a whole chapter in there that's trying to imagine what this alternative community looks like. It's the Catholic workers in particular, again, another sort of substract, if you want, of Christian anarchism, who talk a lot about voluntary poverty. They take it from, I think, from St. Francis, but they take it further, as it were, or insistently. And so it's exactly as you described. It's by not trying to keep to earn more and own more, you don't create also the kind of political economy that basically caters for people's wants rather than needs. So in voluntary poverty, you have both something that might help resolve the issue of poverty, but also in the process a form of, I suppose, asceticism and trying to live in a detached way, being less worried about material issues and material concerns. Of course, you kind of need to feed each other to feed yourself, but you do that by feeding each other. And kind of tied to that is also something that Catholic workers, among others, Tolstoy here as well, would be quite keen on, is bread labor, the idea of working the earth and all contributing and chipping in a sense to sort of help feed the community and one another. The Catholic workers are an interesting example, because they're a community of maybe 200 sort of sites, houses and farms across the US mainly, although not only, founded from sort of 1933 onwards. They're not all Catholic, by the way, despite the name, but that's another long story. But one of the sayings that they have, which I quite like, which kind of captures what they aspire to, it's comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. Yeah. So the first bit is you help migrants, for example, who are often battered by the political economy and even more so where they land close to you in the US, in the UK, whatever. You help them. You help you help the poor. So they'll organize soup kitchens. They'll organize places where they'll just have accommodation for people who are homeless, etc., etc. So there's all that work, and alongside it, there's, by the way, work that some do, so that they would do a lot of what I've just described in some of the houses they might have in bigger cities, but they'll also have kind of farms out further out in the country doing some of the other stuff I mentioned before, the kind of bread labor, working the earth, working together, feeding one another, etc. And yes, they also do the afflicting the comfortable bit. And so that's, if you want, like your standard protesting, civil disobedience if necessary, which they'll often talk about in liturgical terms, which is interesting. So they'll kind of rework and adapt some of the terminology of liturgy and apply it to certain forms of protest or civil disobedience or non-violent resistance of some kind, as a way of drawing attention to be it militarism, war, the cogs of capitalism that are leading to so many people being poor, etc., etc. So they do both of those things. But by now I digress from your question.
Right, right. No, that's great. And you mentioned resistance there, and a big, I guess, issue or theme that's explored with Christian Anarchism, right, is a passage where Jesus says, "Resist not evil," and kind of does that mean be entirely passive and never, you know, make life difficult for the system, or does it mean don't respond to evil with violence? So there's. I wonder if you can share some thoughts on that.
No, that's important. It's an important passage, and you're right to draw me to, because okay, for a lot of Christian anarchists, that passage is critical. It's kind of for a lot of Christian anarchists, the essence of Christian anarchism is basically an insistence on not reproducing, if that's the term, not term they use, violence, and so refusing to be violent, and refusing to respond to violence with violence. It's the turning of the other cheek. Now, that passage you have to look at a bit more carefully in order to unpack it, because Jesus says, you have heard eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other. And then he gives another couple of examples. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone wants you to walk 1 mile, go two. I'm summarizing, I'm paraphrasing. What you have with each of these examples is not a non-reaction. It's not resisting at all in that sense, therefore. And by the way, do not resist is this word. The original Greek is a bit more complex. And so it is a misdescription, a mischaracterization to describe that position as not resisting. It certainly is calling for a response. Jesus is, by turning the other cheek, he's not just sitting there and taking it in. He is almost, I don't know about provocatively, but kind of pointedly pointing the other cheek, and in the process, hopefully, I suppose, exposing the violence that's been done and inviting a different approach, trying to show the human, a human face, I suppose, on his side, but also trying to see the humane in the oppressor. I mean, I'm extrapolating now in the way quite a few Christian anarchists would. And so, but what complicates things a bit further is that the earlier pacifists of the 19th century, before the term pacifism is coined, certainly the strand of pacifism that comes from Christianity at the time will at the time describe itself and be described as non-resistance. Now, it's again a misnomer, because it's not that they're calling for not resistance, but they basically mean, when they say that, not resisting with violence. And Tolstoy as well, in some of the texts that you'll find translated into English, he'll be translated as calling for not resisting. But actually, the moment you read the rest of the paragraph, it's pretty clear that what he means is not resisting with violence, not resisting violence with violence. And to kind of close that loop and add another dimension in the process, you also here get the question of how far you can resist, which is typically something you can explore, I think, with one of the passages that's sometimes thrown at Christian anarchists to kind of apparently prove that they are wrong in interpreting this as a kind of pacifying stance. And it's the passage of the temple cleansing, where Jesus overthrows the tables and says, this was a house of prayer, you've turned it into a den of thieves, or something along those lines. Isn't that violent? And people will say, surely that shows that Jesus is not non-violent. But here's the thing: there's only one gospel of the four where a whip is used, and it is the one gospel where there are cattle mentioned in the text. So the whip, there's no reason to think that the whip is being used in the text against other humans. It's probably used to drive out the cattle from the temple. Now, even and you can certainly that, I think it's John, that one. The other gospels don't speak of a whip. Now, Jesus is upset or angry in a sense. He is denouncing what he sees. And now, therefore, if you are to take up your cross and follow Jesus, it seems you are, I guess, called to a form of action or reaction to injustice or to violence or to evil that ranges anything from turning the other cheek, walking a second mile, almost trying to point the injustice that's being done at that point, up to, I guess, what some might describe as forms of non-violent civil disobedience, or direct action at the very least, overturning the table, etc. But you do have a range of possibilities within those two options. At no point would I argue, and many others do as well, I don't think it's inconsistent. Are you talking about violence? I mean, violence against property, perhaps, but certainly
Right.
not against other human beings. And so it's definitely not resisting. It's not a passive, just accept the injustice of the world. That's not what Jesus does. He does not resist. He keeps telling off the authorities of the time. That's why they arrest him and crucify him. And interestingly, again, another one here, it's the cross. In the cross, he accepts, in being crucified, he almost, I mean, he accepts the punishment that's being meted upon him, but the hope is that in the process, he also illustrates the way to respond to it that he's counseling, which is a form of forgiveness. I mean, he keeps talking about forgiveness, but it's not necessarily just letting the violence happen, is what I'm saying, or the evil happen. Yeah, even in the cross, I got into a rabbit hole there, but yeah. So it's not just not resisting evil is the point. It's not
Right.
resisting evil with evil, or not violence with violence, or something along
Right.
those lines.
Yeah, and I think the human instinct to just use force or to force things to be the way you want them to be. I guess Jesus' example can seem kind of counterintuitive, or it can seem, if you were just hearing about it for the first time, like the day after he was crucified, you might think, okay, well, that guy's gone now. This isn't going to have any impact. And then you look at the gigantic historical impact it had. So just from a kind of secular rational perspective, I feel like when there's that skepticism, it's worth remembering that there's something. I think there's something here that's powerful that you can see. It didn't just peter out when he was crucified. So the idea of self-sacrifice, martyrdom, taking up the cross, is something worth inquiring to at least.
I agree, and I think one thing that's probably not spelled out much, really, certainly not explicitly in the gospel, but which is, I think, at the very least, loudly implicit in it, and it's something that you find in advocates of non-violent resistance, or in the logic of how non-violence seems to work up to today, right? And by that I mean not necessarily religious either, right? So why does non-violent resistance, non-violent action work when it does? And this is where it's different. It seems counterintuitive, and for people, it seems almost mad and suicidal, because the proposed logic, is precisely different from the logic of violence, where you impose with the threat of a gun, the kind of alternative that you want to see, unstable though that will probably prove to be in the long run, and violent and domineering as it is as well. With non-violence, and with Jesus's kind of loving kind of responses, what you seem to get is, I suppose, a hope. Maybe it's a false hope, but maybe not, or a delusion, but maybe not, that the other will be moved sooner or later. Now, it might not be the chief architect of your oppression, but several of the elements that are contributing to this, the cogs of the system that's oppressing you. I'm not talking outside the Christian context specifically, but I think it works from Jesus on as a logic. The idea is that you try and pull apart the pillars of support of the oppression and repression, by showing, kind of by your forgiveness and your loving example, but you're insistent to still call out the injustice, that something's wrong here, but you're not using violence, and you're hoping that in the process you're converting quite a few people on the other side to yours, as it were. And that does seem to be what happens with the cross. Jesus is crucified. You think, oh well, that's the end of that movement, except it's not. It inspires many others to do the same, others who are moved. I mean, let's remember, the story of Paul's conversion is a bit more fantastic than that, but Paul is oppressing Christians when he suddenly flips side, and in the narrative of the traditional Christian narrative, he has some sort of vision. Now, that might be a metaphorical equivalent to, but he realizes the wrongness of what he does. So, of course, if you do not resist evil, in a sense, and just kind of, put yourself forward for being killed, you could imagine logically that if every one of you does that, that's your movement exterminated. Except that's not how it works. It does seem to change the heart, if that's the right term, or move some of the people who do the oppression. And the idea is that that's how you change the world, one heart at a time, by convincing people to kind of join your struggle, or try and build the alternative society you want to see, but from the inside out. You're not imposing it. You're hoping people will be moved to join you in that sense. Now, it is sacrificial to some degree. I mean, it is certainly accepting that you might, and Jesus warns his followers of that you will be. I mean, I forget the terms he uses, but that certainly it will be a difficult struggle. You will be oppressed. You will face it's not violent, but the violence is absorbed rather than thrown back. And this is all counterintuitive, but here's the thing: the way in which nonviolent resistance seems to have operated in the last century or so, when it's really taken off to some degree, kind of echoes that logic that it seems that Jesus has in mind, or certainly Christian anarchists project or understand Jesus to have said, to have been about in his teaching and example. So, I know in what I've just said, Nahir, I've kind of brought together elements of the Christian story, if you will, with kind of more modern secular understanding of how nonviolence works, but they mirror each other, and they say similar things. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and Gandhi was directly inspired by Tolstoy's Christian Anarchism, right? When it comes to pointing to real world examples where this kind of philosophy has had successful effects.
That's right. So I mean, to be fair, and I mean, Tolstoy's not the only inspiration. There are people who say, you got to look
Right.
for, there's Ruskin, there are others, and of course there's Jainism and Hinduism, which are an important part of his heritage, etc. But Gandhi himself certainly says explicitly that Tolstoy was pivotal in confirming the importance of not using violence in any way in his campaigning, and this before he campaigns for Indian independence. But at the time he's in South Africa, and he's working actually for well, against the earlier forms of apartheid at the time, etc. So he does that in South Africa before, and he founds his first ashram. It's called Tolstoy Farm. I mean, he in fact corresponds with Tolstoy briefly. So yes, he himself says that Tolstoy is one of his key inspirations, and yes, then in turn, of course, Gandhi is perhaps the most visible early kind of popularizer, if you want, of the potential force of non-violence in resistance. I mean, his movement is notoriously inspires many others since. Yeah, Martin Luther King. You could find examples before Gandhi that do similar things, but Gandhi is pivotal in showing how non-violence can be kind of operationalized as a tactic to try and get change politically. That's some way removed from Tolstoy, by the way, who's not exactly a strategist, but Tolstoy is a direct inspiration for Gandhi, who then in turn is an important inspiration for so many others since.
Yeah, it's interesting you say he's not a strategist because, as an aside, when it comes to kind of spiritual psychology, one way to think about it, I guess, is that your kind of egoic individual psychology is often about goals and planning and trying to have some kind of end state, whereas spiritual states tend to be kind of eternal, a sense of just being profoundly present without an agenda. And so, as kind of spiritual advice, it feels, like I guess you could say, if you had a goal and you want to create a revolution, you say, okay, in 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, we're going to have this society. It's going to be amazing. But then fast forward the clock another 100 years, 1,000 years, you really can't know what the long-term effects of your actions are going to be if you have some agenda and you're trying to create things to be a certain way. So, and that kind of collapses you into this sense of eternalism where it's just, okay, well, here I am now. I should probably just be the change I want to see in the world, to use that phrase right now, because that really, at the end of the day, that kind of is really what's happening. Is we're here contributing what energy we want to contribute to the world. But so that's to say, even if it was totally ineffective, you could almost say the kind of religious aspect of it. You could say we're not interested in coming to some definite conclusion where we've achieved some goal. There was a great quote, I can't remember which thinker it was in your book, where he says that he basically doesn't think that it will ever succeed in creating some kind of anarchist utopia, but it's the only kind of consistent, sane, I can't remember what word he uses, but position to hold, which really resonated.
Yeah, this is certainly interesting, and this points to kind of some of the tensions that you find in Christian anarchists, but also in the wider kind of non-violent movement, or in non-violent movements more recently, again, non-religious, kind of modern, the 20th, 21st century, which is, for example, at one level you can pit it as this tension between kind of pragmatic and principled non-violence. So that's outside the Christian. I'll bring it back to Christianity in a second, but there are people who adopt non-violent methods to resist whatever they're resisting in their local context because they do not want to take part in violence. So kind of morally or deontologically, they refuse to engage in violence. And then there's those who do so simply because it seems to be more effective. Now, in a way, again, this is oversimplifying, but Tolstoy and Gandhi are almost kind of exemplars of each. So this is a bit too simplistic, but so Tolstoy does not live in a movement. Yeah, he's a writer. He's excited by Jesus' ethics, he spends the last 30 years of his life banging on about this particular interpretation of Christianity from, I suppose, the relative comfort of his home, although he absolutely tries to exemplify as far as he can. Not perfect. He still gets, food cooked for him, etc. But he works the land. He dresses as a peasant. He makes his own shoes. He wants to forego, well, he forgoes all his royalties. He wants to give away his estate. His family doesn't agree. So, but he tries to exemplify this alternative in the here and now. This is getting back to what you're saying, and I mean, and this is an important it's an important insight in quite a few religious traditions and mystical traditions. The kind you embrace kind of almost God now, here and now. If you keep working towards something, you might never get there. That towards keeps shifting in a sense. But with Gandhi and with kind of more strategic applications of nonviolence, you are working towards a goal and you are trying to change something. And with Gandhi, for example, you might well succeed for it, at least to some degree, at least visibly in terms of political independence. We can talk about ongoing neo-colonial forms of inequality, whatever. But so one of the criticisms of Christian pacifists and Christian anarchists is by those who precisely think that you need to be pragmatic. It's not good enough to just stick to it just because it's the right thing to do. And yet, and now, not every Christian anarchist will do what they do simply because it's the right thing to do. But that is one position that you will find. It's an important. I don't know if it's dominant, but it's certainly an important thread within it. And so, yes, I forget who that quote is from in the book. You're right, I remember it. But yeah, the idea being that so even if it doesn't work, that's now the right thing to do in the context of Christianity. The right thing to do isn't just the right thing to do morally, but it's what God wants. It's what So it's what Jesus calls you to do, and whether it works or not, that's the position I'm going to take. Now, that's an interesting position which quite a few people will take within kind of Christian anarchism and elsewhere. But it's also something that precisely some of the critics dislike about it because they want to see some effectiveness too. So what you're pointing to is precisely a tension, which, as I said, to go back to what I said right at the start, is also visible in the way in which nonviolence is conceived and approached by lots of people today outside the Christian context, with that pragmatic versus principled kind of variety, kind of mirrors that.
Right. And actually, when it comes to nonviolence and pacifism, is there a difference in how they're defined?
You're touching on all sorts of interesting tensions. So there are certainly many people who put forward many good arguments to conceive of these as separate things. Pacifism at one level, I suppose the narrowest is a kind of opposition to war, maybe to violence, to interstate war, maybe to violence, but can quickly broaden into kind of opposition to all forms of sort of structural violence as well, and kind of domestic violence, not necessarily in the home, or that too, but in the state, within the state, sort of repression of dissidents, death penalty, etc. And non-violence is typically a term now for some people, and there's a long history of trying to do that. It's precisely used to kind of mark yourself as different from pacifism, because it's a form of activism. More typically, it might be a broader way of life, and here you start getting overlaps with pacifism too, and with some of what we were talking about before. But it's a way of it's a way of acting almost that precisely kind of excludes certain ways of acting from what you're doing, right? And so now, so they're not the same thing, and yet there's strong overlaps. Some of the people who don't like either pacifism or nonviolence will use the terms interchangeably. Some of their advocates will use the terms interchangeably. Their history is overlapping and complicated. So Tolstoy is probably a pacifist of the most absolutist kind, by the way. Few are absolutist pacifists. He's as close as you get almost. Gandhi is more into kind of nonviolence. In fact, he doesn't even use that term. He prefers the ahimsa, right? He makes up his own terms, etc. And that's also partly because the term pacifism is still connoted and seen as a form of naive form of, like as if you could have a world where no violence ever happens. But except that's not what pacifists necessarily even think. Pacifism is much more than just opposition to violence. It's also a set of critiques of militarism, for example, because that feeds into interstate war. So, but you can certainly have people who are sort of non-violent and adopt non-violence as a method, but are not pacifists. You can have pacifists who are not necessarily non-violent. So they are different in all sorts of ways, and yet with strong overlaps, mutually imbricated histories, And that's why the journal I launched last year is the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence. And in the opening editorial, I go into exactly what I described a little bit further, pointing the difference, but also the overlaps. So yeah, you hit on an interesting issue there. So yeah, they're not the same, but they're very close.
Yeah, you're the perfect person to ask that question to. And sorry to throw in a very rich, I think you've dedicated a whole journal to as just a throwaway
Yeah,
question in the middle of an interview there. So I'm sure you could do a whole
fine.
episode on that.
Yeah, no, no, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
And I think so. Just and Tolstoy, by the way, is interesting also in this, in that. So he's. I think it's fair to describe him as a pacifist. Um, Christian's a bit more awkward, but still justified, I think. But as a pacifist, in terms of what he advises, he doesn't have much to say apart from take part in no violence, take no part in violence. So desist yourself from any form of violence. So certainly don't be a soldier, resist conscription if necessary. No, don't be a police officer. Don't act on don't serve on a jury which might inflict violence upon others. But he doesn't have much else to say apart from just don't take part in violence, because for him the problem behind every other is violence. And so in that way, he's, when you really get through to the bottom of it, there isn't a lot of density and richness to what he has to say. What he has to say, he says it in all sorts of interesting and eloquent ways. But it comes down to violence is the problem. If you don't want violence, just don't take part in it. Don't resist, therefore, violently. So in a sense, Tolstoy is a pacifist, but also because he refuses violence and therefore advocates not violence, if not non-violence. And so again, even in him, you find the two kind of intermeshing in interesting ways.
Right. You said not. What's the difference between non-violence and not violence? We're going
I
to go
was
down a rabbit
hoping
hole here
I'd
quickly.
be able to give that. No, yeah. Non-violence is more than non-violence. It's usually non-violent something. So it's non-violent action, non-violent resistance, non-violent campaigning, or non-violence maybe as a way of life. Now, and then by the time you're on the latter, you're close to Tolstoy's advocacy of not violence, because ultimately his thing is to not be violent, but by extension from there, he does therefore advocate, life of the kind of agricultural communities of Russian peasants before the state expanded. So he's advocating, if you want, forms of living that are forms of non-violent living and non-violent relating to one another. He's just not, he doesn't use the term non-violence, it doesn't exist at the time. So he's keen, like, I think you could summarize him as not violence rather than non-violence, what Tolstoy preaches, but it's clearly very close to what we might mean by non-violence, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think I think my putting those together is justified, but I take it requires a bit more unpacking. I hope that makes sense.
And you mentioned that he was an kind of absolute pacifist, and that's kind of a rare position, which is interesting because I think people often reject pacifism because it seems extreme or naive or maybe fixated in a certain way of being over kind of common sense morality. So if you have a school shooter and you just say, okay, well, I guess he's doing that now, and we're all just going to stand by and let it go on until he's done. Like, I think most people would recognize that as a kind of immoral thing to do, to not, even if that person was mentally ill and or was drugged, or say they were a very vulnerable person you have a lot of sympathy for. Even if it's your own child, it's clear you need to use some force to end that situation, just in a kind of basic utilitarian instinct. So some kind of conditional pacifism, I think, resonates more with people to avoid those kinds of things where the non-violence is more of an ideal to orient to rather than something that you fixate on as achieving perfectly. Or is that
Yeah.
kind of compromise a way of evil and violence sneaking back in?
Oh, is that what did you say right at the end there? Is that a
Is
way
it-
of?
is that position that I just laid out of kind of a kind of compromised or a conditional pacifism? Is it a way? Does the whole thing start to fall apart if you don't try to hold very strongly to the non-violence?
So I don't think it falls apart any more than quite a few other ideologies have much more to say than just the kind of absolute version of them that we might imagine. So here's the thing, few pacifists that I have ever met would go as far as to say, no, of course I would not even protect my child if they were being attacked. But there's lots of things to say in reply, and I'll try and keep it really brief. First of all, there's shoot the person attacking. There's all sorts of forms of reaction you can do. I'm reminded here in this conversation of a book I recently read, which I'll be commenting on in the pages of the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence, because we have a little forum discussion on it, and it's Andreas Malm's how to blow up a pipeline. I don't know if you've heard of it. It doesn't actually explain how to blow up pipelines, but it makes the argument that pipelines might need to be blown. So the case for violence against property, against what he frames as pacifism and nonviolence, in trying to slow the warming of the planet. Now, he in there has an example, and he thinks he basically says it almost, you stop being a pacifist if you concede it. He cites the example of a guy who walked into a mosque in, I forget, somewhere in Sweden, maybe in 2013, with a gun, and was basically preparing another of these shootouts that we've heard, and who's only stopped thanks to one of the guys in the mosque. I don't know about beating him, certainly forcing him to the ground and keeping him in a chokehold until police arrive. And the argument in the book is, if you concede to that being acceptable, that's it. You've lost your credibility as a pacifist. You haven't. First of all, he didn't shoot the guy. That's one thing I want to point out. So therefore, there are all sorts of ways you can react, which might involve some force, but there's different degrees of violence as well. That's one point. Secondly, it is problematic to it's called the domestic analogy in the literature, to kind of to infer from how we might react as individuals under attack what states can and should do or would do when under attack. In other words, you're talking about a different level. So it's one thing to be to react as a form of self-defense when under physical attack, so in that mosque, for example, when your child is being attacked. It's a very different thing to have a state be prepared for attack by its neighbor. It requires a whole political economy, military-industrial complex, a set of narratives about friend and enemy, a preparation, which, by the way, will threaten your neighbor and who will therefore do the same. And so you get in a kind of tit-for-tat logic of arms race and escalation. And so and states don't act like individuals do. A state doesn't react impulsively when under attack. In fact, if it's full of emotions, it tends not to act as efficiently as you would want. Every cog in the system needs to perform a particular function. That's not how a person, like a body, a somatic individual, reacts when under attack. So it's problem. There's certainly all sorts of things that are conflated and ignored and obscured when we use the argument of how an individual might act in self-defense to try and justify the way in which states might act in so-called self-defense. And by the way, an individual, if killed, would die. A state might die, but the society, the human beings that compose it, the land doesn't disappear. You just have an alternative. So again, institutions are different from human beings. And finally, also, the thing about that argument is it assumes that all that pacifism has to say is that you are not to resist an attacker, going back to what we were saying before, when it says much more about the way in which we might have built societies that are almost self-fulfillingly going to drive towards war, because we have built a political economy that's basically looking like a military-industrial complex on steroids. I mean, Eisenhower was worried about it in 1961. How much worse has it got now? And so pacifism is much more than just even opposition to war or rejecting violence in any situation. There's much more that can be said from a pacifist position, and therefore, no, you don't just defeat the kind of pacifist proposition or the whole construction of pacifism by suggesting that you might react with some force, maybe even violence, really at the extreme, in self-defense when under attack personally. These are lots of different things that are going on, which are papered over and ignored if you accept that argument. And yet it's widely accepted, and it's a way of dismissing pacifism. And since I'm on a roll, I mean, there's an interesting article published by a colleague and mentor that shows that even in the field of politics and international relations, which is where I work, pacifism is a form of subjugated knowledge. It's a notion he takes from Foucault, but in the following way: it is typically not mentioned in studies of war and violence and peace, even though you'd think it would have a few things to say. And when it is mentioned, even in the scholarship, it's usually a subject of ridicule, dismissed as naive, etc. And that's just based on a complete misunderstanding. You don't need to dig very deep into any pacifist literature to see that there's much more to it than that. And yet, yes, it's typically dismissed. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, that's awesome. I think in talking about the spectrum of when if ever do you employ violence, I think it's important to say that for me the aspect of kind of individual conscience, individual freedom, not imposing on other people. The point of us talking about this is definitely not to moralize to people who are in desperate situations, who are fighting for their lives, to finger wag and say, you should be just dying like Jesus did, so that's an important thing to say. But then also on that,
Yes.
the practical side of violent versus non-violent resistance, something I wanted to circle back to when we were talking about the possibility of the anxiety that this might be entirely impractical and might not achieve anything. You cite some interesting research that actually suggests that non-violent movements to kind of revolutions and movements to claim land have been, or to liberate land, have been more successful, right, than violent revolutions.
Yes. So first, just to underscore what you said, absolutely, it's not about preaching, sacrifice to those who are already struggling, but yes, to go to your question, this long been debate. It's difficult, you see, to determine whether violence or non-violence is more effective. You'll get into debates that they quickly become endless because most campaigns that were primarily non-violent, there may well have been a kind of violent wing or radical flank, as it's called in the literature, that may or may not have played a role in the success or failure of those examples. Most violent campaigns will also have non-violent activism running alongside them. So first of all, it's very difficult to untangle them.
Right.
Secondly, and no one says that violence never works or that non-violence always works. You can find examples that suit you of the thing that you like working and the thing that you don't like not working on either side of the debate. And this could go on quite easily for quite a long while until, I think it's 2011, that book came out. I'm looking at it on my shelf, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. What they do, now, there's been some dispute about the methodology they use, but by and large, it stands. I'll tell you what the main issue is in a second. But they basically, what they do is they look at a period of 1900 to, I think, 2006, and they look at 323 cases of violent and non-violent resistance. Might be to a dam being built or something as more maximalist, as they call it, as regime change or toppling of a dictator. So you're talking that kind of change, not just writing a petition for a law to be cancelled. Substantial change. 323 examples, which they code then as violent or as non-violent, and then they look at the results and they code as three possibilities: success, partial success, or failure. And to their surprise, I think they've confessed in somewhere, but non-violence comes out more effective. It comes out as effective, twice more effective than violence is. So violence works sometimes, but non-violence works more often. Neither works all the time, but also, and even more interestingly, when they succeed. So when violence succeeds, when non-violence succeeds, non-violence tends to herald societies that are more respectful of human rights and democracy and those kinds of values than when violence succeeds, when you typically get more authoritarian drifts, etc., and more violent militaristic societies. So the research does seem to suggest that non-violence is the smarter choice, even pragmatically. That's before you look at two other arguments, the kind of deontological or moral one, violence being more immoral, but also looping back to what we talked about, religiously, in terms of religious authority, if you will. You could advocate non-violence or pacifism just on religious authority. So there's at least three grounds for non-violence. There's a kind of religious one. This might be what God is calling you for, as it were, if you follow the Christian Anarchism tradition. It might be moral. It's immoral to kill, etc. And pragmatic. It seems to be more effective. And just to then be honest, there has been some pushback on that study. But on the whole, it stands. The main pushback that's still sticking, and it's undecided, is whether having a radical flank, as it's called, kind of a violent flank, enhances the chance of effectiveness of a non-violent movement. So the idea that, for example, Martin Luther King may only have been effective thanks to the threat of the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, or that Gandhi was there, but that there were violent nationalists in the fringes. And so suddenly it makes the kind of non-violent militant a more acceptable interlocutor for the powers to negotiate a solution where a lot might be conceded, but therefore it may not have worked on its own without some of the violence in the fringe. Now, the studies on this are inconclusive. There are some studies that suggest that a violent flank helps. There are others that suggest it doesn't. So it's not conclusive. What is clear is that an all-out violent campaign is less effective and damaging in all sorts of ways than a non-violent one, or at least a primarily non-violent one, even if there's a kind of a sort of threat of escalation in the background. That's the research I'm talking about. And I mean, it's a very lively area of research at the moment in civil resistance studies, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'm sitting in Portugal as we speak, and the Carnation Revolution here there were no shots fired, so I would have thought perhaps that would be classified as non-violent, but actually, there was still the threat of, I think, of force being used. So yeah, it's interesting, the landscape of like, how do you classify these things?
Absolutely, but to go back to that example specifically with what we were saying before, the revolution happens basically because precisely elements of the regime change sides. Basically, the army decides it's a coup in the sense that Carnation Revolution with plenty of popular support. By then, people want it. People have been involved in trying to accelerate that kind of revolution for a while. But it happens a bit like in Egypt when Mubarak is toppled by defections, if you want, by elements of the regime changing sides. And that is something you are much less likely to get when the resistance is violent, because at that point, the elements of the regime will pull together, will have plenty of justification to oppress the terrorists, as they might call it, or whatever else. And so, yes, it's precisely the Carnation Revolution, an example of the mechanics of non-violence too. You can get a revolution non-violently, especially precisely because in the part of how it will work will be to get the elements of oppression to flip sides, much less likely with violence.
Right. And so perhaps to end on, I think maybe one of the most important aspects for me in this is the teaching of loving your enemies. So an attitude of universal compassion and universal love. I think that's something that no matter the action you actually carry out, that is a really powerful and important dimension of this, I think, because hate, I guess, is the psychological flip side of violence, right? There's this inner dimension that can be worked on, no matter how it actually plays out in your actions.
Yes, and so I suppose one of the things I like about Christian anarchism and Christian anarchist ways of thinking and those kinds of interpretation of Jesus's teaching and example is that what it highlights is in a Christian vocabulary, with a story of origins that's two millennia old, some of the logics that seem to underlie how non-violence, Christian or not, works today. And so love your enemies is not terminology you'll hear many advocates of non-violence use today, and yet it captures some of the logic according to which non-violence seems to work when it does, even outside a Christian context today. Similarly with turning of the other cheek, etc. So what you have with those is, okay, what Jesus does with those seems to be to point to kind of inner dispositions almost that lead to the issue that you're ostensibly trying to tackle, but that you're not tackling successfully unless you've dealt with that sort of inner impetus to some extent. So loving your enemies sounds like a high order. How can you love your enemies? But you can certainly start by seeing the humane part of your enemies. So, but rather than seeing the people on the other side as scum or pure evil or some sort of less than humane set of human beings, you treat them as human beings, almost with the dignity that they do not expect, and that might shift them. That's partly what might shift them and shift their understanding. So yeah, but you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And so yeah, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Precisely, the challenge is to try and love, at the very least, in the sense of seeing the human and respect the person on the other side, the enemy, indeed. And you get similar logics with not judging one another, because why only what was it? Let he who is without sin among you cast the first stone. So look at yourself before you look at others, and try and therefore, perhaps in the process, it seems to imply, think of what might be driving the other to do so. Be more forgiving of yourself and of others, and turning the other cheek similarly is suggesting that if the problem is violence, maybe you shouldn't be taking part in it yourself as well. So it's kind of looking inwards to some extent and trying to show an example. Now, a lot of that is, of course, couched in Christian vocabulary. It's looking at what Jesus said, and that's how Christian anarchists are invited to think by Christian anarchist interpretations of scripture. Today, you have very similar logics, but in slightly different vocabulary that seem to be articulated by scholarship and activists in nonviolence. So I've long found this interesting. You're looking at similar logics, but using different vocabulary, different authority. Even for Christian anarchists, the authority would be at the very least a text of the New Testament or the story of Jesus as it reaches you. With a lot of nonviolent activism, you don't necessarily have the Christian bit at all, and yet you have logics that seem to be similar to the ones that Jesus seems to be pointing towards, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think there's definitely deep principles at play here, which I think is partly why Christianity caught on in the way that it did. That's a whole other conversation. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this, Alex.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation too.
And where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more? Do you have an online presence anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's a Google site, so it's not particularly sophisticated. But if you Google my name, it's so rare and impossible that at least if you spend a second, you'll quickly land on it. I mean, I
Copy and
try
paste it
and
from the podcast title.
no, yeah, exactly. So there's a way, I have a Google site where I list both kind of public engagement pieces, as I call, so some of the stuff that interviews like these, for example, or stuff I've written more for the broader public, as it were, but also academic publications. So I try and make as much as I can of my academic work available open access. It's not always possible, and for various logics of micromanagement in universities, I can't publish everything open access. I try and do as much as I can, but it's all listed there. So if people are interested, I try and keep that up to date. So that's one place to look.
Great. I'll put a link to that in the description. And thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.